Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Heather Fleming. Heather is the co-founder and executive director of Changelabs, an organization supporting entrepreneurship and innovation on the Navajo Nation. Heather's career in design and innovation and consulting kind of began in Silicon Valley and transitioned to public sector innovation with Catapult Design, which she founded in 2008 and led for a decade. Catapult is a product and service design firm with an expertise in human-centered design for marginalized communities. Heather remains a principal at Catapult Design, partnering with organizations and social entrepreneurs to develop sustainable solutions that address technology and social issues such as rural electrification, water purification and transport, food security, and improved health. Early in her career, Heather co-founded and led a volunteer group, the Appropriate Technology Design Team, focused on social impact design work through a professional chapter of Engineers Without Borders. Heather has been named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum and a PopTech Social Innovation Fellow for her work with Engineers Without Borders and Catapult Design. Previously, she served on the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Engineering and Global Development Committee, chairing an initiative to create standardized evaluation metrics and design guidelines for products distributed to impoverished communities, and is a former board member of the Dene Chamber of Commerce. At Lift Economy, we come across many people who are passionate about the potential promise of technology and design and human-centered design, but oftentimes they leverage their passion and knowledge to create goods and services that meet aspirations for convenience and serve the mandates of exploitation capital in the affluent world, or just perpetuate, sometimes inadvertently, the injustices of our world. It is incredibly refreshing and inspiring to have the privilege to talk to Heather, who has been channeling her brilliance and gifts of design and innovation to meet real human needs for those who have been left out and or exploited by the business as usual economy. I'm already inspired and very grateful. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kevin.
I'm wondering if we could start with a little bit of your story. What is the path that got you into the work that you're doing today?
Well, I grew up on the reservation and I left to go to school in California at the end of the 90s or 98 or so. And I always wanted to come home to the reservation, but there were no jobs or places for me to work at. And at the time in college, I didn't really understand why that was. I was mostly just looking to find a job. And I had studied product design in school. And I was already in an area, the Bay Area, San Francisco, where there was a lot of opportunities for that type of career. So I ended up staying there, even though my intention was to come home and go back. And I sort of found myself in the international development world because I know the exact moment. There's this wonderful man named Martin Fisher, and he founded this really cool social enterprise called Kickstart International that I believe still exists. And I remember he came and spoke at one of my college classes about how he was building these treadle pumps for subsistence farmers in Kenya. And he was showing these pictures of Kenya, a place I had never been before. But I remember thinking wow, that looks kind of like the Navajo Nation. And then he was talking about the culture and some of the issues surrounding poverty and subsistence farming. And again, I was just thinking, these are a lot of the same issues that we have on Navajo. And he was somebody who eventually just inspired my career path in the sense that if I can't go home to work on Navajo, there are so many other places around the world that have similar challenges. And if I couldn't go home to apply my skills there, then there's other outlets for that type of work. So I found myself in the international development sector working at Catapult Design. And I remember talking with a friend of mine who's also Navajo. He lives in San Francisco, and he was the chairman of the board for the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. This is a long story.
Go for it.
And I was asking him we were having lunch one day. I was at Catapult doing all these projects in East Africa and India. A lot of them were solar projects, pay-as-you-go solar technologies and fintech systems. And I was asking him, trying to understand, given the fact that 18% of our homes on Navajo still don't have electricity, why the NTUA and other local providers weren't looking more at solar energy solutions. And he broke it down for me in a very simple way. He basically shared that the cost to extend an electrical line a mile is approximately $25,000 for the NTUA. And combine that with the fact that most of the homes that need electricity on Navajo are rural homes. Mm-hmm. So he was saying, assume that there's a rural house that's only 5 miles away from a grid connection. That's a $125,000 investment to get that home connected to the grid. And then he said the average electrical bill on Navajo is about $30 per month. So the ROI on that investment is already pretty low. But then he said most of those rural households, in our experience, are the ones that can't afford the $30 per month bill. Until those families have jobs that they can apply for, until they have some source of earned income, it's really hard to justify them as customers. That was eye-opening for me, because basically the way he had spelled it out for me was that a lot of these basic necessities that we still lack on Navajo are part of that problem, is the fact that economic development on Navajo isn't enough to provide for the amount of jobs that are needed to provide a lot of those basic necessities. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem in some regards. But he was the first person to sort of highlight to me how few jobs there are, even though I had experienced that myself as a college graduate looking to go home and work. It's easy to just assume that your experience might be an isolated one. And he was the first one to sort of tell me, no, that's actually what most Navajos struggle with, getting home, or if they do live back home on the reservation, that finding a job can be challenging because there's so few employment opportunities. And then I wanted to understand more why there are so few jobs. And another friend of mine, Al Henderson, who used to be the Navajo Division Director of Economic Development on Navajo, introduced me to Jessica Stego, who is now my co-founder at Changelabs. And the three of us, they basically gave me an education on Navajo Nation economics and how all this work that I was doing in East Africa and Kenya, that I was assuming I could bring home with me to Navajo, would be really challenging, because it's very difficult to be a business owner on Navajo. And without small businesses, there's just a severe lack of jobs. And I love a challenge. I also love testing and trying things. And then when I met Jess and Al, I suddenly had peers too, which also made me feel like this is possible. There's enough of us to try and tackle this. Jessica and Al and I started working together, and that eventually led to what exists today. It's Changelabs. I think what we've learned in that time period is that, we started small. We started with an event, then the event turned into a series of all these other events. And then during that time, I was really learning about how complex and systemic this challenge is, and that no single event or no even cluster of events is even going to come close to moving the needle on this challenge. And that to really address the problems with the way economies are structured in native lands requires a dedicated institution, a resource, or whatnot. And we shockingly don't have those resources and institutions for Native communities. And to my knowledge, Changelabs is one of the first. So it's unfortunate that entrepreneurship support organizations that are working in Native communities have to carve these pathways, but that's the reality of it. So I'll pause there.
Thank you for that, bringing the constellation of people together to create what doesn't exist for many tribal nations, this type of innovation and entrepreneurship laboratory and accelerator support system. But I love the organic growth from an event, a series of events, and then finding the alignment. I'm curious if you could maybe elaborate, just for the listeners, though we could probably guess, there's both cultural stuff and structural stuff, and then so much that has happened from exploitation and genocidal efforts of colonization. But Can you highlight some of what makes it challenging to develop, some of the insights that you've had about what makes it difficult to have true economic development and for small business and enterprise with Navajo or other tribal nations as well?
Yeah, and I'll add that so Jessica and I, the first 4 years that we started working together, we were actively mapping this throughout that entire time period. So anytime that we had one of these events or gatherings, we were asking people, handing out sticky notes, asking people to write down, what are the biggest challenges you're facing as a Navajo entrepreneur? And at the end of that time period, we had a whole wall of stickies, and we began to be able to visualize an ecosystem. And there's actually a great framework for entrepreneurship ecosystems. I think it's by Babson College, but we kind of adopted and adapted that to suit our needs. And I would say that some of the challenges are what a lot of rural communities face, like human capital is a big one, in the sense that we're always told as Native people by our leaders to go and get an education. But then when we go and do that, we're too educated to come home to the reservation. So there's this huge brain drain that's happening. I'm sure that's not just a Navajo problem. I think that's probably everywhere. So a lot of the resources that are needed to create businesses and sustain businesses are all now off the reservation. So human capital is huge. Plus, the modernization of our education system is a little lacking. And part of that is due to the infrastructure challenges that exists not just for business owners, but for everybody. I mean, this is a place where still running water can be difficult to come by, or much less electricity or internet connectivity, or even paved roads. So even some of the basics in infrastructure is lacking. And coupled to that, one of the fundamental underlying challenge of infrastructure development in places like Navajo is the fact that Native lands are all leased to us by the federal government. Right. So you can't just go and build your shop somewhere. It's a whole process, and it's a multi-year, complex, expensive process. A process that anybody who's running a startup, it's like you have to become a lawyer, you have to secure all of this money, become an expert in tribal law in order to even make it through this process, which feels too much burden on an entrepreneur. There's also, along those lines, a problem with financial access. So if you live in a place where you can't own your own land and your address isn't recognized by the federal government, it is difficult to apply for any type of loan. You have basically no collateral by design, and you can't even get an employment identification number because there's so few addresses that are recognized. So access to capital is a really huge problem. There's also an extremely caustic business regulatory environment that governs Navajo businesses. So I don't even know where to begin there, but let's start with just like the land leasing process. Why does it take that many years and that much money for entrepreneurs to secure land? The same goes for electricity. And a lot of that is driven by these business policies that were created back in the 1920s that were created by non-native corporations in order to secure mineral leasing rights. And everything that was established back then makes it difficult now to be a small business owner and to survive as a small business owner. Another big factor too is the cultural factor. And I think, to me, when I think about it, one of the most basic things is that there's no direct translation for the word business or entrepreneur in most Indigenous languages, to my knowledge, certainly not in Navajo. So when you're talking about these things, you have to speak in English, which already is a red flag in itself. So whenever we have informally surveyed people on their thoughts about entrepreneurs or businesses, there's a lot of deep negativity. And I think it stems from people's experience with white traders being taken advantage of, colonialism. And along that line, the business lexicon, the English business lexicon, I mean, the fact that even the concept of ownership, I think, is not necessarily in line with Native values and the way Native people think about their businesses, equity, financial equity, that is. So there is a lot of work to be done to strengthen this very weak ecosystem. And I think even more critical or more important is to create new narratives about what Native American entrepreneurship is. Because in my experience coming from San Francisco, where I basically worked in Silicon Valley for 18 years, that's not what we're trying to build on Navajo. And in fact, a lot of the values there are very counter to what I've heard from the entrepreneurs in our community. So we're still at the very beginning of understanding, what does a Native economy look like? And what does success mean for Native communities? How do Native entrepreneurs define wealth? Mm-hmm. And these are, I guess, not simple questions, but they're questions that a lot of us haven't yet explored.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that the answer to those questions, not only for Native economic development, but my guess is that the answer to those questions will be important for actually all of humanity. That the reformation and transformation of the business as usual economy is going to need answers to and access to kind of the indigenous value systems that inform tribal economic development. So again, so grateful that you're doing the work you're doing. So I heard a profound set of challenges, everything from infrastructure to brain drain and human capacity on tribal nations, within tribal nations, tribal lands, land access, determination, tenure, and just so much burden and friction to get anything going. Can you share any early kind of things that you're excited about, that you're seeing traction with Changelabs, with the work that you're doing? Or where's your current optimism for this work?
I love that you asked that question, because just this morning, we posted a story about 4 alumni of our programs. And I should add that we had nothing to do with this. We are grateful to just know all of these fantastic entrepreneurs, but I think we do get to take the credit for introducing all of them. And I think what they have done is what is exactly the sort of thing that we want to see. And we couldn't have planned it better ourselves, but they did it entirely on their own. And it's a great story of how rural entrepreneurs who are facing these challenges can join forces to overcome them together. So we have Jermaine Simonson, who's a prolific Navajo entrepreneur. She runs a rural grocery in a community called Hard Rock, Arizona. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, I'll say. Her primary community is elders, and she works really hard to get them access to fresh foods. Because a lot of vendors don't deliver out to where she is, she's often putting in, her own time and money to go to Tuba City or even the border towns to meet vendors to bring back to her store. So she kind of recently recognized that one of the other graduates in her class, his name is Carlos Deal, he was running a mobile food truck. He has a culinary degree. And when he was going through our program, what he really wanted to do was produce fresh meals using, nothing from KFC, nothing from McDonald's, and nothing from Taco Bell. But what is it like to eat fresh lettuce these days on the reservation in a place that's basically a food desert? So he was going to the border towns, bringing in salads and whatnot, just so that people had an alternative to the Taco Bells and the McDonald's of the world if they wanted lunch. But what he didn't have, what Carlos didn't have, was physical space. That evades most entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. But Jermaine had a physical space. So they teamed up so that he could provide fresh meals to her community members. And he was also using her building as a place to cook and to prepare all of these foods. But then they took it a step further. Also, I think the class behind them was Chiji Farms, which is a Navajo farm in the Loop area, and also Coffee Pot Farms. They're one of our borrowers in our microloan programs. Carlos reached out to them to see if they could supply all of the food for his meals that he was making in Hard Rock. So now we have 4 Navajo businesses that have teamed up to create this beautiful little ecosystem where each of them is relying on the strengths and the assets of the other to make their business model work. And that's really what it's all about. And if we could replicate things like that, or I don't think Changelabs should actually. I mean, entrepreneurs are creative, resourceful, and innovative. And this is exactly the sort of behavior that we want to see. And if we had any part in that by helping make introductions or helping them vet each other because they were all Changelabs program participants, then great for us. But really, a lot of this was their doing. And that is the sort of activity that we need on Navajo to build these sort of self-sustaining ecosystems where our entrepreneurs can rely on each other, collaborate, and partner to provide our communities with what they need.
So beautiful, the interdependent relationships between these various entities. And I'm sure Changelab is, a non-trivial thing to make that facilitated intro, but also you mentioned the capital, at least for one of the partners in that ecosystem as it's developing. And you mentioned one of the barriers being capital. You also mentioned the lack of collateralization of any assets in terms of land or ownership. And I'm wondering if you could wave a magic wand that there was capital facility that was available for development. I'm imagining it would be, obviously non-extractive or could be just straight up philanthropic contributions, which I think is going to be necessary for the repair that needs to happen in the world. But if it was also to have some return component, I'm imagining it's loans, non-extractive loans, patient capital. But I'm curious if you could elaborate on the work that Changelabs is doing with microlending, as well as what some of the listeners of Next Economy Now are looking for ways to provide more capital for economic development that is in alignment with a world that works for everybody. And I'm wondering if you could inform us as to what should that look like?
Yeah. Well, Changelabs is part of the Co-op Capital program in New Mexico. I think it's being championed, or it is being championed by Nusenda Credit Union. The Co-op Capital program has more or less taken a page from all of the beautiful fintech models that I saw in mostly Kenya and India years ago, where you have people like Muhammad Yunus who were establishing character-based lending models, lending to women entrepreneurs. And Co-op Capital basically borrows from some of the best practices that came out of a lot of that early work. So it's character-based lending, where each of the Co-op Capital partners, so Changelabs being one of them, we basically select people in our community who are, based on our own definition of eligibility, can apply for these microloans. And they're anywhere, at least for Changelabs, it's anywhere between $1,000 to $10,000. And there's no fees, there's no collateral required, no assets required. And it's collateralized by philanthropy, as you mentioned. The model was initially enabled by a program-related investment by the Kellogg Foundation. But since Kellogg and Nusenda initiated this, a lot of the partners like Changelabs, we've been able to raise our own philanthropic funds to collateralize a lot of our loans. And it's beautiful. It's basically philanthropy and community members coming forward to guarantee loans for other community members. And the program is young enough. It's about 2 years old, at least for Changelabs. I think for the rest of the Co-op Capital community, it's a little bit longer. It's too early to have definitive results, but we launched it in March 2020, right at a time when everybody was confused and wondering what was going on. And I do know that the loans that we provided that summer were lifelines for people. This was before PPP stuff started coming out and EIDL loans. And even then, a lot of those federal programs weren't relevant to business owners on Navajo if they couldn't even get an EIN to qualify for some of these things. So where you're in a place where traditional lending and federal loans and federal programs can't reach, there really is nothing else.
Yeah, right. So they're needed. And so finding ways like building institutions like Changelabs to fill that gap is critical. I'm wondering if you could share with listeners a little bit more about some of the programs that Changelabs has. You shared about its function, but there's the incubator and some of how you went from these events and like one-off events and a series of events to some of the work that you're doing in terms of the training and even the co-working, or if you could share about what programmatically you're up to, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of just spoke about kinship lending, which is what we call the Co-op Capital program that we're partnered with in New Mexico. And that is our loan program for Navajo and Hopi entrepreneurs. And you just mentioned that we run a business incubator, that the business incubator is designed to serve 20 high potential entrepreneurs each year. It's a 1-year program. And it's 1 year because it can take a really long time to help people navigate the complexities of the business regulatory environment on Navajo. So we cover everything from business model canvas basics to a lot of financial training, branding and marketing. I guess, I would say a lot of things that traditional business incubators and accelerator programs cover. And graduates at the end can apply for a $10,000 loan if they choose to. Mm-hmm. And then the other primary program for the entrepreneurs in our community is the co-working space. And the co-working space is there because physical infrastructure is few and far between. And as a result, the majority of sole proprietors on Navajo are working from their home because there's no retail infrastructure, there's no buildings or land that they can access for their communities. So in that regard, co-working spaces, which don't exist on Navajo, I believe we're the first, if not one of the first, are kind of the only places that entrepreneurs can use to ensure access to the internet or a color printer, or we have like a little Cricut machine in there. We have button making, like all these little tools that people can use to prototype this or that, or try out marketing tactics. It's also a place where people can go just to talk to a business coach. So if they're having trouble with their business site lease, or they want to apply for one, or they got a letter from the Navajo Tax Commission and they don't understand what they're supposed to do, they can come in and there's a person with a friendly face that they can talk to who can help them navigate some of those challenges. But the most important role that the co-working space plays is purely in its ability to facilitate peer networking. And we've read in our evaluation and reports and heard in conversations with our community members that the most valuable thing that they take away from anything with Changelabs is just the connections that they make to other entrepreneurs, to not feel like they're trying to do this all by themselves, that there's other people out there going through the same emotional roller coaster that they are, everything that comes with trying to start and run a business. But besides co-working, business incubation, and lending, the other critical thing we do at Changelabs is a program that we call Doing Business. And it is our attempt to document the challenges of business entrepreneurship through quantitative and qualitative data. And what we found is that there is so little data on how many businesses are even operating on the Navajo Nation. Most of the sole proprietors are not tax-paying sole proprietors because of the caustic business regulatory environment. And because of that, there's no way to realistically analyze what impact the Navajo small business community plays in the general economic development for the Navajo Nation. And to me, that is sad, because when I look around, it's so clear that the vast majority of businesses on Navajo are sole proprietors. They're artisans, they're people selling fry bread on the side of the road, they're jewelry makers, they're all the people enrolled in our business incubator, hair cutters, mobile, auto mechanics. And because of everything working against them, trying to run their business on Navajo, they're not counted. And if you're not counted, then our council delegates aren't going to vote for infrastructure if they don't know that there's thousands of entrepreneurs out there that need this. It's a huge problem in our ecosystem, actually, that there's no data, there's no research, there's no studies to document the depth of this challenge. So we are attempting to do that. And we've released 2 reports so far, but more to come.
Is the idea there that if you can document what, in other places might be called the informal economy, but the activity that's happening, that if there were council members making votes that, for example, in acknowledgement of the existence and the importance of this to community well-being, that there would be additional resourcing that might be available, or that maybe there would be more sincere effort to reform some of the caustic environment and barriers to either formalizing or at least celebrating the capacity of all this informal activity.
Yes.
Is it, yeah.
Well, definitely. I mean, when Changelabs in the past, many years ago, I remember one of the first presentations that we made to tribal council. We were talking about our work, and one of the council delegates' response was, well, there's no businesses in my community, so I don't understand why you guys are doing all of this. And he was from a community where maybe if you just were driving through, you might think that there were no businesses, but I guarantee that a lot of people were just in their homes, beating their jewelry or making fry bread to sell the chapter that day, but they're not acknowledged as small business owners, and they're not acknowledged for how they contribute to the economy. Mm-hmm. And to me, that lack of acknowledgement is also a testament to a lack of education or a lack of awareness of what role that these people play in sustaining Navajo families and contributing to our livelihoods. And our first report was trying to compare apples to apples. We wanted to know, how easy is it to be a Navajo Nation entrepreneur operating on Navajo versus in nearby border town Cortez, Colorado, or in New York, or in Kigali, Rwanda? How does it compare? Mm-hmm. And we had our assumptions going in that it was harder to be a Navajo entrepreneur, but then we were using an established set of indicators by the World Bank. We were able to see that being an entrepreneur on Navajo is about as easy as being an entrepreneur in the Central African Republic, that we are way far behind, even just in comparison to Colorado or New Mexico or the state of Arizona. And I think that in itself was important to us because that is just, in my mind, fundamentally not acknowledged by a lot of our elected leaders. And taking the time to collect that evidence and that data to back it up was important to us. And the latest study we did was about the economic impact of COVID-19 on the Navajo small business community. And it's going to be released at the end of this month. And that too, the Navajo Nation has been allocated $2 billion in ARPA funds. And we would like to see a chunk of that money go towards not just economic development in terms of money going to tribal enterprises and casinos and whatnot, but what about the small business community? If you're going to invest 40% in tribal enterprises, then 60% should be set aside to develop the small business community. It's a huge opportunity for us to develop that infrastructure, to build those support networks, and possibly even to reform policy. And it would be a shame if we didn't use the money that way.
Yeah. I hear in your approach at Changelabs a lot of design thinking, and you mentioned evaluations, gathering the data. And I wonder if you want to say anything about the way the incubator operates, or just the operational DNA of Changelabs, if your work in human-centered design and innovation inform how some of the ways in which it informs that work. And the reason I want to bring it up is, again, I mentioned at the outset that we encounter a lot of people with like a background in human-centered design or even technology. But then when we talk to them about how are you leveraging your experience and passion for that to actually benefit people and planet, a lot of people get trapped by business as usual economy and exploitation capitalism. And it's rare to find people who authentically are able to bring their skills to bear for actually improving the world. And I'd love to hear if you have any comments about how you're leveraging some of your work at Catapult and your background in the work at Changelabs.
When Changelabs was first conceived back in 2014, the whole thing in itself was, I guess, a prototype or an experiment. And I remember even documenting some of our assumptions in true design form. And then I think you said it earlier, and one of our funders put it this way, that we set a lot of, from the initial success of that first event, we decided to light more fires to see what would catch and what wouldn't. And to me, that was, at least for me, it was my whole comfort or familiarity with prototyping a lot of different things and then testing them to see which one worked and what didn't. But what became clear, it took a long time. It wasn't just one prototype test. It was 4 years of testing and documenting. And the ultimate realization at the end of it was that basically none of the fires were enough. That was at the time when we were really able to start mapping that ecosystem and also comprehending, I think, for the first time that the problem was so complex and so deep that just even setting a bunch of fires wasn't going to cut it. We had to light a bonfire or something like that. So I want to think that the origin of Changelabs in itself was the result of the design process. But besides that, in a lot of our internal documents, I have that one of our core values is constant iteration. And I say that because, well, with COVID, I think everything had to be rethunk really quickly. And I am so proud that we got kinship lending off the ground within a week of the Navajo Nation shutting down at the end of March. And I think it was because we all embraced that mentality. It's like, we just got to try. We can't get caught up in these things. We've got to put something out there, let people react to it, and we'll evolve and we'll grow as we go. And I think the benefit of Changelabs being a young and small organization is that still works for us. We have been able to adapt based on feedback from our community, based on a global pandemic, based on emerging partnerships and emerging interest, I guess I should say, in Native American economy building. And I attribute a lot of that to, I guess, my early career as a designer and just being comfortable in ambiguity and being comfortable in trying different things and learning from them.
Beautiful. It seems built into all the way into the identity of the organization, or at least the label Changelabs is there. So yeah, I love the integral nature of it all. Well, I'm wondering if maybe you could share, maybe it's like a last kind of vector of inquiry for this conversation. What are some of the things you mentioned, some of the projects and the ecosystems that are emerging that are inspiring to you, and all these amazing humans that you get to work with? But I'm curious if maybe you would share what else we should know about that listeners should be tracking, watching, or ways for listeners to support as well. How could they learn more? What are some of the things that you might share with listeners?
Well, it's a really interesting time, actually. Think about, we have Deb Holland running Interior, the first Native woman from New Mexico. She's familiar with a lot of the challenges that entrepreneurs are facing. So I'm so eager to see if there is going to be any fundamental change in the relationships between the BIA and Native lands. So to me, that is it's like a really interesting period in time where we have a pandemic, we have a Native woman in charge of Department of Interior in the BIA, and we have a growing, or at least at the moment, there's a lot of eyes on small businesses, the economy, and whatnot. There's also, I would say, still a nuanced but growing consortium of entrepreneurship support organizations that are Native-led and focused on Native issues. So Changelabs, New Mexico Community Capital, Vanessa Rowenhorst, Jamie Glache, and Alicia Ortega at Native Women Lead, Dave Castillo at Native Capital Access, Laura Vogel, Forbands. There's probably more organizations now that are budding and emerging than ever before. The Native American Business Incubator Act, I believe, will be going out for public RFP maybe by the end of this year, early next year. But with all of these things now in motion, this is probably the most momentum that you've ever seen for this type of work. And it's an exciting time to be involved. I would say whenever somebody asks me, how they can support, one thing that I always like to point out is a lot of these issues that Native people are facing, they need to be solved by Native people. I don't know if there's a softer way to put it. And speaking about that earlier collaboration between Rocky Ridge, Alternative Eats, and Chiji Farms and Coffee Farms, that was all them. It's just a beautiful thing to see. But I know that when I'm looking for organizations to support in this realm, I'm always checking, is it a Native-led organization? Is it Native-controlled? Are there Native people from those communities on that board? And that, to me, should be the very first thing that anybody should check for if they want to support this work, because the ultimate goal of a lot of this is self-reliance and self-sustainability. The whole point of it is to decrease our reliance on outside actors and outside players. So if you see an organization and you're not quite sure, check who's running it, check who the board members are. And I think that's a good testament for where to put your support.
So well put. I think that could be a precept for all sorts of well-intentioned efforts to contribute to changing the world from anybody, is look at, does this actually contribute to self-determination, self-reliance, and do some of that investigative work before trying to find a way to support, just actually being thoughtful and discerning. I think that's excellent guidance and very important. Heather, is there anything else that you'd like Next Economy Now listeners to be thinking about, or how they might take action, or anything else that is inspiring you, or anything else that comes to mind?
I mean, all the people that I listed, especially those partners are in, they're inspiring to me now. And all of them deserve to be looked into. And I just thank you for inviting me today. I really appreciate any and all opportunity to talk about the work going on around Native economies.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for joining Next Economy Now. And I'm sure we can have more conversation at a later date to continue to learn more about Changelabs and the excellent work you're doing. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.